بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
You are not like other carbon-based life forms. You put the value of all life above your own.
Welcome to the first episode of the second season, Silent Messages, of the fourth podcast. I'm Ali Wazir.
I'm Ibrahim Ali.
And I'm Talha Muhammad.
And you can help us grow by giving us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod. So welcome back to the fourth podcast. We hope you didn't miss us too much last week. We're back though, and as announced on our social media, the theme of this season is Silent Messages. Ibrahim, what can you tell us about the theme?
Silent Messages was a book written in 1971 by Albert Mehrabian, professor at UCLA. The book talks about the importance of verbal and nonverbal communication, including body and not limited to body language. This season, we're not going to just talk about verbal and nonverbal communication with others, but about empathy in general.
We're otherwise keeping the same structure as Season 1, so in this episode we're going to talk about current affairs.
Some people were lucky enough to be born rich. For the rest of us, we have to work and work hard in order to survive. The plight of the working class has been a focal point of politics since at least the French Revolution. But even 2 centuries later, the working class still suffer under the heel of the elite.
So, how do we go about defining who the elite are as opposed to the working class? Like, what are some useful definitions for us to have before continuing this conversation?
Personally, the way, I don't know if you guys define it the same way, but the way I define the working class and elite is that I look at people who own the capital versus people who produce the capital. And I think there's a big difference in between those two. And then I feel like in each sector in society, we have different subsections of, the working class and elite. So you look at our socioeconomic standing, right? Me, you, and Ali, right? Me, Talha, and Ali. In our scope of society, we have the most common professions in our demographic would be like doctor, engineer, lawyer, right? Because we're brown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have 2 doctors over here and, a future engineer, inshallah. So we're playing right into the stereotype. So if you look at the way that most people get their jobs get their money in these professions, it's usually through either work in a hospital or work in an IT company. And at the end of the day, you're producing a service, or you're giving a service to somebody who's paying you for a fraction of the cost of the service that you're producing. So you're not really getting the full benefit of your work, and there's still somebody who's profiting off of your labor.
I think that's a great point, man. What really happens, especially as physicians, is you're working in a clinic or you're working for a larger hospital system, and the eventual bill that a physician receives, as you mentioned, Ibrahim, is actually a very, very small portion of what the patient actually pays. Now, you also mentioned how individuals that go into these type of fields work under a bigger system. How about, for example, individuals that work in car factories, individuals that work in coal mines, individuals that work on farms? Because to the average American, that is the working class. That blue-collar worker that gets up 9 to 5 or even 9 to 9, as a farmer, for example, would do, and just works their tail off to provide a good, decent, earning for their family.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction there. So there's definitely the idea of the working class that we have, especially as Americans, of somebody who actually, physically works, what in other countries would be called perhaps the laborer class. Mm-hmm. But I think for the purposes of this episode and this season especially, it's important to remember that the working class isn't just people who have to do manual labor, but also people in general who don't own the capital, like people who produce the capital. That's the working class.
So rather than, sorry, I'm just trying to bounce off that point, man.
Yeah, no problem.
Rather than looking at the physical laborers and the specific income brackets that are set for the middle class, lower class, and higher class, now we're looking at who actually owns the capital and who is working to produce that capital.
For sure, man. Yeah, go ahead.
And as I mentioned before, right, in each subsection of society, we have different levels of wealth and different levels of, I would say exploitation of people and their labor. So you have, our engineers and doctors, and you would still say that in this society they're pretty well off compared to the other professions, like we just mentioned. Auto workers, people who work, very hard and difficult jobs, or people who work for very menial wages.
Right. So yeah, I mean, like you were saying, Ali, I don't think it's about the salary brackets at all. Like some CEOs have a salary of like $1, right? And those kind of things make like headlines because they're like, oh wow, look at this philanthropist CEO who only takes $1 salary. But it's about like the actual meaningful net worth that they have where they can control things. So like, for example, Jeff Bezos, right? He has actual meaningful wealth in that he owns a massive corporation that pretty much everybody uses every day, because Amazon isn't just like the delivery service, but also they provide web services that most websites today are hosted on. And then also, like, he owns the Washington Post, so he has a lot of control over American media, and he owns a space company. What is it called? Blue Planet?
SpaceX.
No, SpaceX is
That's
Elon.
SpaceX.
Oh boy, that's Elon Musk.
Yeah.
I think it's like Origin something. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that.
Tala, that's a great point, man. Also, looking at individuals that hold and maintain the wealth, you have individuals like Bill Gates. You have individuals like the Koch brothers, who are very, very well known for pouring millions and millions of dollars into our elections, actually.
Yeah.
And
our media cycles as well, of course. Yeah.
And bringing it back to our main theme of this season, the empathy of the working class has to be viewed from a very holistic lens. You have to be able to identify the working class, as we all mentioned, and those that have the power. And also, I think a great example of this, just to start off, would be the workers in regards to GM and the recent strike that just occurred, where you had over 55,000 workers in over 50 different cities go on strike for nearly a month with no pay, and they were actually advocating for, I believe it was health benefits, equal pay or more pay, and also just more rights in the workplace. And it's really interesting to see how that took place over the course of a month for a massive company like GM.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that was one of the biggest strikes of any kind in this country in a while, for sure. It's really important because right over there we can see the difference between the working class and the elite. So sure, this working class was one that we traditionally think of as a working class because most of the people striking were actual factory workers, like automobile factory workers. But they were striking against the management of GM, which restricted their healthcare, restricted their leave, work leave, and all this kind of stuff. And so they came out and they striked against these conditions. And what we're trying to figure out here today is, like, how do we build empathy with them?
So I think this brings up a more overarching point. Of how we can have empathy with people who work jobs that require unions, right? So this brings up an even wider demographic of people that are affected by unionization. A couple of really good examples would be teachers' unions, because teachers are criminally underpaid in our country. Another really good example would be video game developers. They have to work brutal hours, brutal shifts, and overtime with no overtime pay to produce games that we enjoy on a daily basis. A general lack of empathy that I see in the ruling class of society, where the owners of these companies don't allow their workers to unionize. And I think one way for us to build empathy in our societies or in our social circles would be to empathize with these workers who want to have unions and who want to unionize to get better rights.
For sure, man. In 1945, about a third of American workers belonged to labor unions, whereas today it's 10% and decreasing every year. It's really important to notice also that this is not an organic decline. Obviously, this was pressed by most major corporations, like I know for sure Walmart does this. I don't know what other corporations do this, but when they hire you, you have to watch like this video, that just talks about how bad unions are, clearly made by upper management, and they're just trying to dissuade you from ever unionizing. And so we do need to, empathize with people who are in unions and trying to unionize, because in my opinion, and you guys are free to disagree, I think everybody should unionize in any workplace, right? Like all working class people should unionize.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point. I think it's pretty valid.
Because I think companies should in the first place just care about their employees. If they did enough, you wouldn't have to unionize, right? Straight up.
But the entire nature of the capitalistic society that we live in is that few people own a lot of the wealth, and they try to increase their wealth in any way possible.
Yeah, I understand that, but to what degree does increasing your wealth trample upon other people's morals and rights? Like, does it not cross moral boundaries? For example, the GM example, they weren't receiving healthcare benefits. How does that affect your workers' families, and overall, how does that affect future American generations? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Is like you're not just messing with I understand you're trying to get that money, and that's perfect. You do you. But at the same time, what's going to happen to the generation that your kids or your children and your lineage is going to live upon?
That's why we have to unionize.
Yeah, I think most people who are that greedy to begin with, they don't really care about their unions' families at all. And these are the people who ultimately become the billionaires, right?
Well, also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does great work, man.
Really, you buy into that propaganda? Like, they have a really good PR team. That's why you believe
the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation donates money to Hindutva organizations
in India. Yeah, that's actually right. Speaking of India, India also has some crazy big general strikes. Like, I think 10 million people plus.
Yeah,
they had a massive general strike like in 2016. Oh wow, it was actually 150 million to 180 million.
That's a crazy amount of the population.
That's like half of America coming out.
But again, they have a population of a billion people.
That's true.
Still, it's like 10%.
It was called the largest strike in human history.
Do you know what was the strike about? Which company?
So it wasn't just one company. Like, it was a general strike. So a lot of people came out because in India, India used to have better policies for their workers back in the day. But as of recent, especially under the BJP party, they're very pro this kind of capitalism where a lot of workers have just been losing rights. Like, the amount of suicides that happen in India from like farmers losing land to big corporations and then going bankrupt is just massive, and I think this is part of what caused these general strikes.
Yeah, it also. Oh, sorry if you don't mind. It also has to do with Narendra Modi's economic policies.
Because he was elected in 2015, right? And this was in 2016.
And this was a 24-hour strike, and it also dealt with banks primarily, because every single bank in India was shut except for the State Bank of India. So not every single bank. Let me clarify. Private banks were shut in most of the states.
So I think one important thing that we should try not to fall into is the pitfall of blaming these super right-wing leaders like Narendra Modi and Trump for the effect of capitalism, which is these poor labor conditions of the working class. In fact, in my opinion, you guys feel free to disagree with me on this one, but Trump and Modi, I'm just giving these two as an example. There's many more, like the Brazilian president is another example.
Yeah, Bolsonaro.
These right-wing leaders are not the cause of these problems, but they're just the effect of the circumstances that were created by the people who were in power before them.
Oh yeah, for sure. We're not just talking about like what I guess American media perceives as right-wing leaders, but also neoliberal leaders, right? Like, a lot of the world order created today was by neoliberal influences back in the aftermath of World War II. I think it was at Mount Vernon or something. A lot of the Western powers that were still, I guess, had people alive came together some place in like New Hampshire or something. And they came up with the world order that was very, very neoliberal. Like, that was kind of the beginning of neoliberalism, where it established free trade across borders, but kept in a capitalist system without there was kind of standardization of trade so that resources could flow across countries, but not of like human flight across countries, right?
I think, so you mentioned, Ibrahim, more of a conservative viewpoint of politicians in Trump and Modi, right? And we have to bring about the neoliberalism and also the liberal foundation that was set for these leaders.
So the point... go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead, man.
So the point I was trying to make is that
you're a Trump supporter.
No. The point I was trying to make is that Trump is a result of these neoliberal policies, and the conditions that these neoliberal politicians set the world in. They're not the cause of the problem. They are just a side effect of the problem.
Wait, so neoliberalism is the cause or the...
That's the cause of the problem.
Okay, so that's the cause, and then like the fascist, quote-unquote fascist right-wing leaders like Modi,
that's
like
just
Bolsonaro.
The end result.
Okay, that's the symptom of the
Yeah.
cause. I totally agree with you, man. So I'm not blaming this lack of empathy for unions on right-wing leaders because this was created during neoliberal eras as well. I'm pretty sure like Tony Blair is famous for continuing Thatcherist policies in the UK. You know, she was a Tory. He was he was part of the Labour Party ostensibly, but he continued those same policies, and union membership in the UK declined during Blair's time.
So we were talking about India, right? So do you guys think...
Oh yeah, in India too. I mean, like the Congress Party is a quote-unquote opposition party to Modi's BJP, but they're really neoliberal, and they created a lot of these policies that eventually led to Modi getting in power. But continue.
So their social structure, right? The class system that they have is the caste system, which is basically our system, our social class system, but just on steroids. Like it's the disparity between the working class and like the Muslims right now over there and other other classes in society drastically the difference is much greater in between those two. So do you guys think the poor labor conditions we see in India and these other countries is due to that?
Is it to what exactly? I'm sorry.
The caste system.
I think that definitely plays a role in it, Ibrahim. When it comes down to many individuals, for example, how do you increase in your social class? Like, how do you move from one social class to the next? It's very hard to see it within one's own lifetime.
The point is that in India, the caste system in Hinduism is like set. You're born into it. You can't if you're like an untouchable or a Dalit, whatever. I don't know the exact terminology, but like you can never become a Brahmin, right? But this plays a part for sure because there's a lot of casteism left over in India, but this I think all needs to be analyzed, and you guys are free to disagree, obviously. But I think that this is more of like a secondary cause today, and the primary problem in most of the world today is actually just the difference in wealth equality, right? So the distribution of wealth. And, going back to those neoliberal policies I was talking about, obviously a big part of liberalism is that, like, everyone is equal under the law and whatnot. Political equality for all, but
Allegedly,
yes. Political equality for all, but they'll never stop to consider economic equality at all. So I think India did have, like, a president from, like, the untouchable class or something. So obviously that's the liberals trying to...
Well, what's interesting, man, is that you mentioned India, now you bring it to a national or international scale. But on a national level, we see an effect of the similar sorts in regards to education, where individuals that are born in a certain area code or a certain district, they don't receive the same educational resources here in America versus individuals that, for example, might live in Highland Park or a richer area of the United States. Because now you see an increase. There was a New York Times article recently published about the education in America and how you see a greater amount of white individuals and their children moving towards private education and children moving from the typical public school education towards a private education system, and also minorities leaving the private school educational system and moving towards a public education system.
So I think the point that you made that in liberalism, the concept that everybody has equal political representation is flawed because that our politics have so much money behind it, right? There's a lot of big money in politics, and like we said, these people who own the capital, they can influence the election because they own a significant, substantial amount of wealth that they can do real change with in society. And for the most part, it's negative change. It's not positive change for anybody. So, and again, like you mentioned, right? There's a lot of inequality in wealth and, resource distribution, especially amongst disenfranchised communities in America, especially like the Black community, right? They're especially in education, like you mentioned.
Going off of private education as well, that's that goes back to what we were talking about originally, where the increase in private education actually stemmed from the decrease of teacher union membership. So if teachers, and I mean, I'm going to take this way back for a second real quick.
Yeah.
The important part of unionship is that the workers in any workplace will always outnumber the management and the elite, right?
Yeah, by all means.
Right? Because they're the people who's making the wealth, and you only need a few people to be able to skim off that wealth and get wealthy by doing nothing.
Are you calling for revolution?
I might be.
Oh, gentlemen, we got to tone it down a bit.
But that's the point of unionship, is that when everybody who's working teams up together, they have a lot more power because there's always power in numbers. So that's part of the increase in private education, was that if teachers are discouraged from unionizing, then they don't have such good benefits. And then a private like a private educational system can pop up and say, oh, we're gonna pay you guys better, because they're taking money from their students and offer a better education that way. And Ali, I'm gonna harp on you for a second, but because you seem so proud of Bill and Melinda Gates.
Yeah, dude. My idols, bro.
Bill Gates actually pushes for charter schools very heavily in this country.
So do I.
You push for we're about to take you down, buddy. But charter schools are obviously a form of private education, and those also benefit greatly from the decrease of teacher unionship, because in public schools, teachers, like in any public sector, you can't stop people from unionizing. But if you pull them away from the public sector and put them in the private sector, then yes, you have a say in whether they can unionize or not, because you can fire them easily and without cause.
Yeah, so Talha, I think you bring up a really good point when we're talking about charter schools. So personally, I mean, I went to a private school that wasn't necessarily, I'm gonna use racial terms over here. It wasn't white, or it wasn't upper class, or it wasn't wealthy, and you can see the.
How much did you used to pay? I'm just kidding.
60 grand. No.
So you can see a clear difference even in private schools, right? Within let's say a private school in Highland Park, Texas, right, where your boy George Bush lives.
Yeah.
Private school in,
I'm so disappointed.
or a private school in let's say Richardson, Texas. So without naming any names. So you can see like a clear difference in because the private schools in the more wealthier private schools belong to people who own capital in our society, and the private schools are less well off. So you can see a clear difference in between the resources that are available to people who own capital versus the resources that are available to the working class, even the well-to-do working classes in our social circle, in our social sphere.
Bringing it back to the theme of the plight of the working class and how we can relate to them, how do we? I know we talked about a lot of the issues that are going on, whether it be the influence of the wealthy influencers in politics, whether it be strikes that occur, whether it be the education system or the caste system overseas. Now, how do we propose solutions to this? I know it's a big thing to ask, but just off the top of your head or any ideas you may have.
The title for this season is Silent Messages, right? And, on an individual basis, I think we should be on a lookout for the silent messages that the working class of our society are giving. Like when people start asking for healthcare, Medicare for all.
Or increase in minimum wage.
Increase in minimum wage. We should be paying attention to that. That would be the first step towards more change, would be awareness within ourselves and, empathizing with those people.
Yeah, I'll continue off that, Ibrahim. To answer you, Ali, I mean, in order to do more, we obviously all need to get together, because the working class and I'm putting us as part of the working class because none of us here, we're born with a silver spoon in our mouths. We need to come together and not fall into like the distinctions that the elites are trying to push upon us, obviously. And part of that is also like getting rid of some of the rhetoric that they do try and instill in our language and in our media. Like, a natural kind of reaction when you see somebody who's working a minimum wage job is that they didn't work hard enough in school, right? They're here because of their own life choices. That's often not the case. Like, for most people, like, a lot of the reason why they're poor is because of external factors that they can't control at all. Now they're part of the working class and they're trying to make it out, and there's no reason for us to be nasty towards them or think that, we're better than them.
Yeah, I think we're fed this story of an individual that is a failure in the American dream as someone, as you mentioned, that's just lazy or just not smart enough or didn't work hard enough. And that's, as you mentioned, just not the case. And I've seen it time and time again in my own personal life. But we have to, as you both mentioned, be on the lookout for the signs and signals that the working class throw up, whether it be a strike, whether it be asking for better health care or better pay. We have to be aware of that, what's going on in our society, and also be conscious of the politicians that are running and their platforms and positions on these issues. It's crucial as listeners and ourselves to recognize these issues, because your vote, and I'm not trying to get political here,
Bernie 2020.
but your vote and your consciousness of these issues matters in how our country is shaped and formed.
So I think...
How much are you paid by Soros? Just before we continue.
Undisclosed amount. We shall keep that. Undisclosed. Yeah. So I think we need to realize that these stereotypes of the working class being lazy and that these stem from a propaganda effort from people who own news media outlets, which is again the ruling class, like Rupert Murdoch, who owns Fox News. And I would say that it's not the origin of these stereotypes. Fox News is a major perpetrator of these stereotypes. And again, if we want to solve these conditions of the working class, we have to recognize that the ruling class, it's all one big party, right? And they're trying to divide us. A common narrative that they had was that immigrants were coming from overseas and taking their jobs.
Immigrants are not the problem.
Again, it's the ruling class, right? They're taking the job that they were exploiting the white citizen over, and then they're exploiting an immigrant even more than they were exploiting the white worker.
You know what's interesting is how white Americans specifically, get so triggered at immigrants who are more willing to do their job just because the immigrants are more willing to put in the hard work. But the white Americans are unwilling to look at the individuals that are hiring these people and be like, hey, wait a minute, you're the problem as well. Rather than just these people that are taking your jobs, look at the people that are hiring these people to take your jobs as well.
Yeah, so this immigration, I mean, this is a classical example of neoliberalism where if your native population starts getting a bit wealthy and like starts demanding something higher, like, maybe free healthcare or higher minimum wage, then you can just like bring in an immigrant who'll do it for much less without knowing better, right?
That's true.
So that was like something beautiful that neoliberalism created. But also going back to silent messages, I think that we definitely need to be more receptive of silent messages from the low and like the working class, because and I worked at a homeless shelter for a while, and most of the people who were over there were not people who were drug addicts or anything. It was, I'll tell you, the majority of people in there were people who led nice, comfortable lives, and then someone in their family got really sick, and the hospital bills just added up, and eventually they went bankrupt, right? And that's a real silent message over there. I think if this is happening to so many people across the country, isn't it time to maybe consider free healthcare? Should healthcare be political at all?
No, I don't
that's
think
not
so.
even how it is. That's such an American problem.
Is healthcare all right, or is it
not to get too political? But I think having an economic bill of rights is actually a very good idea. Having the right to healthcare, to housing.
Well, is healthcare? Hold up there, Brahim.
All right, Mr. Doctor.
I'm gonna have to cut you off there.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Because is healthcare a right or a privilege? Because the reality is, should all three of us here have to pay for the bill of an individual hypothetical. Let's say a 700-pound woman that ate herself to the point where she can't get up out of bed.
Okay.
And now all of a sudden she has bed sores that have gotten to the point where they're almost infected.
Okay.
And so we have to pay for surgery on her legs, lower legs, removal of those bed sores, removal of the, I'm not going to get too descriptive here because they get really nasty. We have to pay for all that treatment, even though she had the opportunity to just eat less. Literally just eat less and not obtain that. I'm not saying, I'm giving you an example, right? Obviously, there are individuals that have legitimate diseases that cause them to be, morbidly obese or even a little bit more obese. Should we have to pay for that?
Counterpoint.
What's the counterpoint, son?
So we have the insulin epidemic in the United States, right? Why should the sale of insulin be privatized when people are barely affording and they're rationing their insulin supplies? I feel like people who can afford to pay that should, again, this is bringing it back to empathy. Again, man, we should be willing to support somebody else in need. That's a core point of the season, right, is empathy. We should empathize for the person who's not able to pay for their insulin.
No, I recognize.
We should empathize for the person, again, like you said, 700-pound obese woman or man.
I mean, honestly, there does need to be empathy over there because, no one that I know eats themselves until they're 700 pounds,
Son,
overweight.
Have you met the average American?
I mean, there has
Is that
to be
a pop joke over there?
So, I mean, there has to be some pre-existing...
No, but okay, even that. I'm sorry to cut you off, Ibrahim, but just really quickly, okay? The reason that so many Americans are overweight is because of the way that... Oh, man, I'm going on a big tangent here.
Go ahead.
Right?
Yeah,
It's because of food subsidies in this country. The government does not subsidize because of lobbies from companies and corporations like Monsanto. The government does not subsidize healthy foods that people can eat. So what's the most subsidized is big grain like corn and wheat. Those are very heavily subsidized. So the cheapest food that you can get if you're a poor working class person is something like massive pizzas.
Oh, like McDonald's.
And McDonald's, yes.
I didn't realize that, man. That's a great point. I didn't realize that the American government didn't subsidize food for...
I mean, I think there are definitely some subsidies on vegetables and fruits and such, but I mean, just go look at, go to Walmart or Kroger or something and see how much more something like fresh carrots or fresh
Forget
tomatoes.
Walmart or Kroger. I mean, Walmart and Kroger is for people who can still afford to do groceries on a monthly basis.
And people who live in places where they can't
Walmart.
access. Yeah.
There's places in the United States that are called food deserts.
Big time.
Especially in the inner cities and black communities, because again, people who own capital didn't want to serve the minority or the black community because
those people aren't wealthy to begin with.
Exactly. So there's been a systemic lack of nutrition and healthy options for people, and they were never educated about the importance of exercise, and they were just eating to survive basically every single day. And when you have a mentality like that, when you're living like that on a day-to-day basis, nutrition and healthy eating, watching your sodium intake is the least of your concerns, right? That's why you see that there's so many health problems, especially in the black community, right? High cholesterol,
high blood pressure
is because of all these poor eating and dietary choices.
Community here in the United States that's been a big victim of this has to be the community of 75216, that zip code. It's a massive food desert to where you won't even see a Whole Foods or a Walmart, as both of you mentioned, because these big corporations, they don't want to go into those areas and spend money just to give back to society. You will find, actually, for these communities, the Dollar Tree actually serves as the local Walmart.
Wow. What kind of food do you get at Dollar Tree? It's like Lay's chips, right? And Coke. And
again, you said Whole Foods, right?
Yeah.
Whole Foods is owned by Amazon. And Amazon is owned by
Jeff Bezos. You hate Jeff Bezos.
And again, we're using his headphone adapter at the moment right now.
Oh man,
Amazon Basics.
We're gonna be uploading this to a site I'm pretty sure is paid by Amazon Web Services.
Yeah, so we also look at the pricing of these foods, right? The pricing, like in Whole Foods, right? Whole Foods is actually whole paycheck. You gotta spend your entire month's salary to get healthy produce. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, organic products and whatnot. So Ibrahim, one of the solutions that I'd like to point out would be, number one, being able to give healthcare education to these communities. many of them lack healthcare education or they distrust physicians. And I don't necessarily blame the African American population in the United States for distrusting the healthcare, the healthcare system.
Back in the 1920s, white doctors would go around in majority black areas and make black women infertile so that they couldn't give birth anymore. So yeah, wow. I mean, I think there's a inherent distrust of doctors.
Not only that, the whole Tuskegee experiment.
Oh yeah, that as too, well. Man, that was messed up.
Enlighten me.
So, the Tuskegee experiment began in the early 1900s, in which the FBI took a community of Tuskegee, Alabama, I believe, and went around and attempted to conduct a scientific experiment, which they infected African American males with the
syphilis.
Yeah, the syphilis disease. Okay. And this, as you can imagine, being left untreated, led to hallucinations, many deaths, infertility, and just a huge, drastic change to the population's view of how they see, physicians and medicine in general. So you have to be able to give healthcare education to the community. Not only that, you have to be able to provide sustainable outlets by which they can obtain healthier options to eat. Mm-hmm. You can't just provide the education, all talk, but no action. You have to be able to get in there and give them available, whether it be a community food garden, right? Whether it be a pantry, with legitimate food to give to them, or whether it be, perhaps going from volunteers from a higher income community, going to these lower income communities and offering, a food market or whatnot as well.
I mean, that brings it back to empathy.
Yeah, totally. It's all about empathy, right? Like we only touched on a few of the problems, like a minute amount of problems that the working class faces every single day. Yeah. And so to build that empathy is just about educating yourself. So when you look at, the point is, it's not to punch down, Mm-hmm. Like if you see somebody poorer than you, it's not about hating them. It's about empathizing with them, right? And if you see somebody who's struggling with life, it's probably better to give them a break than anything else. So we only touched on a couple of things. The listener could also easily go and research this stuff themselves, like the amount of problems and difficulties that they face. It's best to just keep those empathy levels high when you're out there.
So I think, in my opinion, this is the solution to the working class's plight, right? So I think it starts with, first of all, it's awareness amongst the working class.
Mm-hmm. Of who they are and
it's the realization that we are all in the working class. Mm-hmm. I hope there's somebody in the ruling class because we need sponsorships. I mean, as far as I'm aware, our people who listen to this would be considered working class.
Yeah, even if your dad's an engineer or a doctor, mm-hmm. Or a professor or something, that's still the working class.
Especially if they're those professions. Because, I mean, they're the more well-off to do in society in mm-hmm. Those sort of professions. I think second of all would be, establishing empathy with people who are...
living in unfortunate conditions.
Yeah, living in unfortunate circumstances. And then the second last would be, building political awareness and, supporting people who support agendas or support the rights of workers in the United States. Because I see a major problem especially with my peer group, is that nobody is politically literate. Mm-hmm. No one knows the issues. No one knows who's supporting which issues. And I'm not advocating for any certain candidate over the other. But, at least be literate of the issues that you care about, especially the issues of the working class.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ibrahim and Talha, I think you guys touched up on all the great solutions that we can offer to our listeners and ourselves as well. And for our listeners, I want to thank you all for tuning into the second season and first episode of the second season of the Fourth Podcast. Again, be sure to give us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod, PROD. And be sure to tune in again next week when we'll talk about empathy in our culture. As of now, we hope you have a great rest of the week.